The Torah speaks about the Eshish Pastor, which we just mentioned yesterday. We just read a few of the psukim, that a person's in battle and he sees a woman and he's attracted to her, although she's not Jewish, although she's a married woman. He's permitted to engage with her sexually, even though she's not Jewish at the time. And he's permitted to take her back from the battlefront. And she undergoes this process. If he's interested in marrying her, he marries her. But ultimately, if a child is born from this union, there's a good chance it's going to be a Ben Sora Mora. It's going to be a rebellious child. Where does the Torah allude to this? Because in Posuk Tezvov, the Torah tells us, Kisenu li shtei noshim. A man has two wives. Achas ahuva, achas snua. One is beloved, one is despised. Yodlu bonim ahuva v'asnua. And he has children, both these women. Voya ben abchil, b'chor lasnio. And the firstborn is born to the one who's despised. It speaks about the laws of inheritance. Nevertheless, the firstborn receives a double portion of inheritance. As we discussed at the end of Bamidbar, a Bechor receives two portions. So over here, why does the Torah juxtapose the Ben Sora Mora to the Eshivas Torah to tell us that if you take this woman and you have a child from her, very likely the child's going to be this rebellious child, this defiant child, which ultimately he's going to have to be put to death by the court, by the Bezdin. And if you don't put him to court, ultimately he's going to turn out to be a highwayman, a murderer, and he'll be put to death for committing murder. That's the juxtaposition of the Ben Sora Mora to the Eshish Vastor. Over here, the Malaturim in Tezvov, right? Shtei nosh machsu v'achas nuah. Over here, v'hoya ben ha'bechol asniya hainu b'nei asnua shu. Okay. Okay. Okay, leader. Over here, he cites an interesting medrash, the Balaturim. Liish Zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We know Hashem is referred to as Ish, like Ish, Hashem Ish Mulchama. So the medrash says, "B'medrash Doresh Liish Zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ahuva Elumos." The nations are called Ahuva. Why are they called Ahuva? He treats them differently than he treats us. Shamar Lem Ponim. Because despite the fact that they're always failing and behaving not in order, nevertheless, he treats them with kid gloves. Shnua, Elu Yisrael Shemaste Me'ponim. We know in Hebrew, the sin and the samach, they're interchangeable. Klasa Shnua, Hashem conceals his face from us. Meaning that Hashem, very often, he goes into concealment when we have misbehavior. And therefore, what's the confirmation of that? Because we have problems, we're persecuted, we're displaced, discriminated against. So Hashem is masdeponim, right? We read in the Tocha, Anochi has to ask the Ponai, that if you misbehave, I will go into concealment, and all the tsaris come upon the Jewish people, which we'll read next week's parsha in Kisovo. That's what happens. So Snu is alluding to Hashem's relationship with Klal Yisrael. He's masdeponim. One indication of that our relation with Hashem is different than the nations of the world. The Jew counts, his calendar is according to the lunar year. The moon, the times where the moon is a full moon, and there's a time when the moon goes into concealment. Ultimately, at the end of time, as we say when we have Kiddush Levana, we see at the end of time, the light of the moon will be no less than the light of the sun. Because initially, when Hashem created the world, there were two luminaries, and because of the Medrash, which Medrash cites that the moon says, how do we have two kings wearing the same crown? Hashem says, if that's the case, you'll be minimized. You'll be minimized. And therefore, the moon only reflects the light of the sun. But who represents the moon? Klal Yisrael. Because our situation is we rise and fall. The sun every day rises, shines brightly, sets, and rises immediately. Klal Yisrael, it's not so simple. We start at almost an unnoticeable level. We rise to a point, then we become minimized, not to be seen at all. That's snua. But that's an indication of Hashem masti ponav mimenu. Hashem conceals his face from us. It's interesting. We find that the Gemara tells us that Pnei Moshe K'nei Chamo, Pnei Yoshua K'nei Levana. If you want Moshe, his presence, his face, if you would compare it, it would be the equivalent of the sun. Yoshua, who was a successor, who was his Talmud, is K'nei Levana. He's the equivalent of the moon. As great as Yeshua was, and although he was qualified to be Moshe's successor, and he was chosen by Hashem, but factually, he's only a reflection of his Rebbe. Moshe Rabbeinu being the Rebbe, he was the son. Everything emanated from him. Not only emanated from him, the Gemara tells us that when Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah at Sinai, Shechina medaberes b'to grono, the Shechina spoke through his throat, meaning he was just a conduit. He was a conduit for the Shechina. Yeshua, although he's a prophet, there was this gap. He was only giving over what his Rebbe had taught him. Because Torah is only what was received directly to Moshe Rabbeinu. Anything beyond that, it's Moshe Kibul Torah Misina Masorah Yeshua. Yeshua is only the Masorah, that's the tradition. But the direct connection to Hashem, that's Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the sun. The sun is the source. That's the source of light. We receive it from Moshe Rabbeinu. That's a reflection. We're reflecting what we receive from Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the sun. That's the moon. The moon is a reflection of the what? Of the sun. Snua is alluding to Hashem is Master Ponav. Because ultimately, because we don't have the obviousness of Hashem's presence, therefore very often we go off the cliff. We do things which are not acceptable, and therefore Hashem distanced himself from us. That's Anochi Astepanai. I will go into concealment. The Gemara tells us in Megillah, Esther, her name really was Hadassah, but she was called Esther. Why? Because during that period of time, there was Hesteponim. Hashem was in concealment. There were no open miracles. What happened at Purim, it was what? It was concealed, it was cloaked in nature. And that's the reason why it's cited. The only Megillah that does not have the name of Hashem mentioned is Megillah Esther. Because the miracle that happened on Purim was all cloaked in nature. Unless you read the script well, you don't see the hand of Hashem. So Esther represents Anochi Haster Astepanai. Hashem was in concealment. After the destruction of the first base of Mikdash, Hashem went into concealment. By Sheni, there were no revealed miracles. There were many things that were lacking in the second base of Mikdash. The Gemara says 5 things were lacking: the Shechina, the Oron, during the Tumim. There's certain things weren't in Bayesheni, but that's Snua. But who's the Ahuva? It's Umas Olam, nations of the world. That but it's interesting. The Gemara tells us now, but Zorah quotes a pasuk in Chavakuk, where Hashem treats us like a rooster pecks in the barnyard. He pecks at the kernels of whatever it eats. The kernels, that's where Hashem pecks at us. What does it mean? What is it analogous to? So the Gemara tells us a king lends an enormous amount of money to one of his subjects, although there was no special relationship. And he says to that subject, borrows, you could have the money up to a certain point, but after an extended period of time, I want you to pay the debt. And when you pay it in full. To his closest friend, his closest subject, he says, I'm going to lend you money, but I want you to pay every month or every week. I want you to be part of that debt. So the person who's the intimate of the king says to him, The stranger, the one who doesn't have that special relationship, you say he can pay later. He doesn't have the burden of paying have to be burdened every month. He has to pay that debt. But me, there's a continuous payment of debt, and it creates a tremendous amount of pressure. He says, you don't understand. When it comes to the end of time, if that debt is not paid, which it won't be paid, I will destroy them. Every moment, I'm collecting debt. And that's the reason why I treat you differently. Because I know ultimately, to wait till the end for the due date to pay debt, nobody is able to pay that debt. So therefore, it says the way the rooster pecks, the word in the Hebrew is pick. The way the rooster pecks in the barnyard, that's the way I'm going to pick at you throughout history. I'm going to collect small increments of that debt. So at the end of time, you'll burn the mortgage, and you'll be able to have the ability to burn the mortgage to pay off the final payment on that debt. That's what the reason why we're snua. The snua is only because it's now best interest to be treated this very strict with reining in on us continuously, because only then, at the end of time, do we exist. Nations of the world, they're ahuva, but that ahuva now is not really in their best interest. But since they're not the objective of creation, of existence, therefore Hashem treats them differently than He treats us for that reason. It says that non-Jews, the nation of the world, should not be punished in this world. There should not be illness, there should not be disease. Illness and disease should only come upon the Jewish people. Why? Because the physical world is the nations of the world. Therefore, ultimately, if there has to be punishment, it should take place in the spiritual world. The Jew, the physical world, is not his place. We're only here as the world is a medium to be challenged and to succeed. As a result of that, when we fail, an indication to confirm that failing, we should have illness and sickness and all kinds of problems. So why does Hashem allow the problems to come upon nations of the world, the illness and the disease and everything else? Because if Hashem would not, it would be Chil Hashem. It'll be a desecration of God's name. What are people going to say? The Jewish people are accursed people. They're subject to disease. They carry disease. They carry illness. They have all kinds of problems. And because the Jews will be seen as accursed people, and we're God's chosen people, therefore Hashem says, you know something? I'm spreading the wealth. The nation of the world will have disease and illness like the Jew. However, but to the degree that we are treated with this exactness, that's only the Jew. It's not the nations of the world. It's interesting, Ezel Chochem Rosa Nolad. A person is wise, he sees the ramifications down the road. After everything's said and done, as I always mention the name of Yaakov Emden, although we don't live in an era of revealed miracles, there's one revealed miracle which continuously is obvious, the existence of the Jewish people. No nation in the history of this existence has undergone what we've undergone. Civilizations wanting to annihilate us, destroy us. And despite that, these civilizations no longer exist. And we exist, and we're still thriving. We have our peaks, we have our valleys, but we're still here. And we're still here as a Jewish people. And although there's assimilation, there are casualties, there's fall off, but the core is here. So at the end of the day, what does it prove? Who is the Ahuva? The so-called Ahuva, the nations of the world, where are they? Babylon, Rome, all these nations, they're gone. So even though when they're in power, Rome was for 500 years, they were height of power. They believed they were invincible. What happened? Rome collapsed. Babylon went. Greece went. Everyone went. So what does that say? And we're still here. So ultimately, who is the Ahuva? Who's the beloved? Meaning, when you see with that limited lens, it seems to be the nation of the world of the beloved. The Jews are the despised one. Of course, we're being mistreated. But ultimately, in retrospect, when we see we're here and they're not here, what does that say? Just to the contrary. We are the ones who are the beloved. Hashem used them as the so-called, as the stick, as the staff, and allowed them to make choices to persecute us, to destroy us, but ultimately they were destroyed, and we continuously to thrive and advance. So the Snu and Ahuva is a misreading of the reality, because we're short-sighted. We don't see the long-term effect of this Ahuva and the Snua. And the Ahuva is like a person we had by the Parsha Shmini. Non-Jews are not bound to dietary laws. Jews are bound to different dietary laws. And it says, V'chai. If you want to live, you have to keep dietary laws. So the Medrash says, what is it analogous to? You have two people who are very not well, and the doctor says to the family of the patient, one of them, whatever he wants, you could feed him, give him any request he has, just keep giving him. The other patient, who seemingly has the same degree of illness, he says, you have to be careful. You have to, what he eats, where he sleeps, that he's warm, it's in a damp location, and his diet is crucial. So the people ask the doctor, why this patient do you treat this way? And this, he says, you don't say, the other patient, there's no hope, he's gone. So the little time he has left, give him whatever he wants. The other patient has realms to recovery. So because he has realms to recovery, and he has to live, therefore you have to be literally so careful what he eats, where he sleeps, and what you expose him to. That's the difference between the Jewish people and the nation of the world. The nations of the world have no relevance to achieve what they're supposed to achieve, because they failed in the past. When at Sinai, Hashem offered the Torah, they rejected it. Not that they were ever worthy for it, but they have to be offered Torah. We said Nasav Nishma. That's the core of the Jew. Because that's the core of the Jew, therefore Hashem gave us positive, negative commandments to maintain that spirituality, and we live, and the world is only a medium to be challenged, to succeed, to achieve what we're supposed to achieve. That's why the ultimate, the Ahuva of Klal Yisrael, and the Snua are what of the nations of the world, and he's only giving them what they want, because ultimately they're going out of existence. And Sanhedrin, that Ben Sura Mora, this rebellious child, lo hoya velo osed lios. It never ever happened, and it can never happen in the future. So, and it shows based on the psukim that there's certain criteria you have to meet. It's not possible to happen. So Mar asks, so why does the Torah write this, the scenario, the narrative of the Ben Sura Mora? Lidrush l'kabel schar, to study it and receive reward. So the simple understanding is, you study it and you get reward for studying Torah. So the early context is, if that's the case, the Mishnah tells us in Brachos that if a person says Kriya Shema after the Zman, and you say the Psukim, you get Schar Talmud Torah. You're rewarded for studying Torah. So what do we need? The narrative, the Ben Sura Mora, any Torah we study, you're rewarded for studying Torah. So the Rabbeinu Bachya cites the Rashba. The Rashba writes, Lidrus Kauskar, you should study it and delve into it. And the takeaway is the schar. It's the lesson. What's the lesson you learn from Ben Sura Mora? You have a child, he's just became bar mitzvah. But yet it's he's 13 and 33 months. He hasn't really fully matured, but he's entered into the state of adulthood. And he goes and he steals from his parents, unbeknown to them, and he purchases meat and he purchases wine. And there are many, and he has it with certain people, so the environment is not a good environment. And his parents rebuke him, and he's a rebellious child. The parents take him to court, to the Bezdin, and they tell the Bezdin what happened. Both parents, father and mother, and the court gives him lashes, gives him malchus, and they warn him that if you become a repeat offender, we're going to put you to death. That's what they tell the son. And the son becomes a repeated offender. Again, he steals. Again, he buys the wine and the meat and everything else. Torah says this child has developed an addiction. Ultimately, if he's not taken out now, ultimately, he's going to become addicted, and he's going to totally consume all his parents, all their money, their assets, and he's going to become a highwayman, a gangster he's going to kill to support his habit. Now, so Rabbeinu Bachir cites the Rashba. Whoever heard of parents taking a child to Besdin where they understand he's going to be put to death? How are they going to see it? They're going to dismiss it as what? Immaturity. It was just bar mitzvah. What does he understand? And they'll try to somehow cover it up and to delude themselves, although the Torah says he's destined to become a murderer. Unless you nip it in the bud, he's going to be a murderer. That's what the Torah says. So now the question is, do you submit yourself to what the Torah is? The Torah's prognosis and diagnosis is that, do you, or say no? I'm not. That you submit to the Torah, to allow yourself to give your child, even to be put to death, you know what that is? That's a semblance of the Akedah, of the Avram Avinu. Here Avram's promised he's going to have the special son, and he's special. All of a sudden he tells him, Hashem says, bring him up as a burnt offering. Avram rises early in the morning, brings him as a korban, as a burnt offering. That was his level of negation to the will of Hashem. A parent, a Jew is negated to the will of Hashem. Hashem says, my reading is this, that's the reality. So if that's the reality, do you want your son to become a murderer? The parents, they have difficulty accepting this. But if you totally are negated to Hashem's will, and you understand his reading is the reality, you're not wanting to understand it, that's your delusion, then you bring the child. So the literals, Kabbalah stars, study this portion and be rewarded, meaning to learn the lesson well. That regardless of what we believe, we have to submit and negate ourselves to what Hashem says. And if we do, then we follow as Hashem wants us to follow. That's how the Rashba explains literals, Kabbalah star. That we have to live lives always as an occasion. We're willing to make sacrifices based on our rational process. Human process is difficult, but if you negate yourself to Hashem, then what? Then it's the semblance of an Akedah. Or the ultimate, the source of all the angel that represents, that gives us every level of challenge. What we call the Satan, the Yitzhara, the prosecutor of Jewish people. He captured very special souls at that time.
Yeah.
Remember I mentioned this?
Yeah.
Eishishpas Torah means the person has some kind of attraction to the tzaddikim. It's totally out of character. And it says even if she's as ugly as sin, what's the attraction? So then that attraction may be an indication that woman possesses that special neshama. Okay, we'll read it inside to hear it more specifically. Okay, let's do the what's appropriate for a person who has trust in Hashem regarding his personal sustenance. Years ago, to be a Shomer Shabbos in America wasn't easy. Because since Saturday was a work day, if the person didn't come to work on Shabbos, the employer told him on Friday, don't come back. If you show up Saturday morning, you have a job. If not, don't come back. It wasn't easy. You realized there was no government assistance. Families, they had nothing. That means you'd have to scrounge for your family, maybe for weeks or months. It was a very difficult challenge. But if you understand that every challenge is there because Hashem provides the challenge, and if it's met, and the timeline is not your timelines, when Hashem decides to bring it regarding your own sustenance, Hashem withholds the support a day or two, or as long as he supports it. So what do you say to yourself? How do you read the challenge? What's going on? Asher Yehutziani Yolat Olam Hazeh Bizman Yedua Beis Yedua. Hashem brought me into this existence, and I'll be here for a certain amount of time. I didn't come into existence earlier or later. I came into existence now. So the one who brought me into this existence, and he brought me now, not previous generation, not the next generation. And he's the one who's withholding my support, my sustenance. Ladato mashu tovli. The reason is, as he brought me into this existence to ultimately achieve what's good for me, because if I meet the challenges, then I merit the ultimate. Identically, that he's withholding my personal support, he will provide it when it's time. When his timeline is, he'll provide it. That's what you have to tell yourself. We say dynamis. We don't understand. Hashem has his own timeline. There's a famous story with Gemara, Rav and Shmuel. Rav originally was a Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda Nossi. Rav was so great, it says Rav Tanu Polik, although he was an Amora, but in terms of his standing, there were times that he could even argue with the Talmud. That's how great Rav was. Rav originally was mentored in Eretz Yisrael. He went to Bavel. When he went to Bavel, he raised the caliber of Torah in Bavel to be on the same caliber as Eretz Yisrael. So when he was traveling from Bavel, from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he was going on a ship, and he had some kind of stomach ailment, intestinal ailment, maybe a parasite, whatever it was. And in those days, what a person would do is bodily functions, they would dump the waste over the side of the boat, and it would very often float on the water. Shmuel, who was the colleague and contemporary of Rav and Shmuel throughout Shas, had never met Rav before. And Rav was the leading Torah sage in Bavel. And he was a doctor. Rav was a doctor, a medical doctor. And he was standing at the port, and he noticed from what was floating on the water that somebody's coming who's suffering from a certain type of intestinal problem. He saw from the waste what it looked like on the water, and he sends his gabbai, one of his students, and he heard somebody's coming from Eretz Yisrael, a great Torah sage. He should go and engage in Torah discussion with him to see what his caliber is. And if he's really special, he personally will heal him. He'll provide whatever remedy is needed to heal him. Evidently, it wasn't simple. So he sends his Talmud or his Gabbai, his attendant to the port. Rav gets off, and the person starts engages in Torah discussion with Rav. Rav had no idea why this person thought he was asking all kinds of questions. What's the halacha here? What's this? And Rav was able to respond. And the person, he realized that he is a great Torah sage. But Rav picked up after a while that he's really testing him. It's not really these are questions that he wants to know, but rather he's testing him to see if he's really a Talmud Chacham. Rav gets upset, and he says something very strong to this person, and then he tells him that he's the attendant of Shmuel. He's inviting him to Shmuel's house to be hosted. He comes to Shmuel's house, his home, hosts him elaborately, and he gives him a certain kind of beer to drink. And this beer was a type of what was going to affect him, that it would create such turmoil in his intestines, in his digestive system, and he's going to have such pain, he's going to feel like he's going to burst. That's the level of pain. And the only way he'll be able to relieve himself, he has to go out to an outhouse to relieve himself. But Shmuel's not going to show him where the outhouse is. And he's going to agonize in pain and writhe in pain that he feels like he's going to die from the pain. So all of a sudden, he drinks the beer and everything else, and right away he feels the pain and what's going on, the turmoil and the agitation in his intestines and his stomach. So he says to Shmuel, could you show me where I could go do my bodily functions? Shmuel just ignores him, doesn't even pay attention. And he keeps going and going, and he feels like he's ready to pass out. And Shmuel doesn't respond. So he goes in a state of pain and he curses Shmuel. And he says to Shmuel, you should never merit to have a son. In anger, because of pain, he says, you should never merit to have a son. And then afterwards, Shmuel says, go there, you do the bodily functions. And he relieved himself and he was healed. Because he had to have that agitation and all this swooshing and pain. That was the recovery process. So when he relieved himself, it cleansed his whole system, that he was relieved from this parasite. Afterwards, Rav realized he made a mistake. That the reason why he withheld the location was in his best interest. And Rav was great at Shmuel. And he regretted that he actually cursed him. And we know that when a Talmud Chacham gives a curse, God forbid, even though it's mistaken, it finds its mark. Shmuel never had sons because of his curse. So for the rest of his life, whenever Rav and Shmuel would go anywhere, Rav would go out of his way to give greater honor to Shmuel than himself. If they go through a doorway, he would say to Shmuel, you go first. To acknowledge him that he's special because of what he did. So here Shmuel believes, Rav believes, he's being tortured by this man. This man is cruel. Only later when you realize that he was a doctor and this was the remedy for recovery, then he was appreciative that he regretted that he spoke out of turn. If a person has belief in God, that the reason why you're here because he put you on this earth and he will provide for you. And the reason why you're born today and not the previous generation or the future generation, in this setting, it's all because that's God's doing. So God has his own timeline. God will provide. So why did he provide? The answer is God has his own timeline. God is not bound to your timeline. He will. And if you have that faith and you have that trust, then you're able to what? To deal with all these challenges. That's the way that's the perspective you have to have. So all the Jews who did not violate Shabbos in the early part of 20th century, until nearly World War II, where it was a challenge not to violate Shabbos for the sake of livelihood, how did they toe the line? There's no way we're violating Shabbos. It's going to work out. Is it going to be difficult? It'll be difficult. But that's part of the challenge of being a Jew. It's difficult. Hashem's testing us. And they did it happily, many of them. Happily. Because they're dedicated. If you're dedicated, you're happy to meet the challenge. Head on. What's going to be? Hashem is the one who dictates life. He wrote the script. I live based on what he wrote for me. In a certain way, we're all actors. You know, a person is an actor. He follows the script. And he behaves, and he's subject to whatever the script says. Every one of us is subject to the script. Whatever script Hashem wrote for us. And we have to meet those challenges. Only the actor knows the whole thing has no relevance to him. We believe it does have relevance to us, but that relevance, it's in our best interest to be able to meet those challenges. If the Chofetz Chaim would live in our generation, Jews would be different. Chofetz Chaim, what he was, he radiated holiness, and he had such understanding how to deal with issues. But the reason why we were here, because we don't have the Chofetz Chaim. So Chazon Ish says, you don't understand. Life is challenges. And the reason why you were born in a generation where there is no Chofetz Chaim is because your challenge is not to have a Chofetz Chaim. And that's why you're born in this generation, not in his generation, or not in the future generation. So whatever setting you're born into, that's the setting of your challenges, and everything's tailor-made to be able to deal with it within that context of whatever Hashem has in store for you. Okay.